Welcome to Windows PowerShell. I'm Don Jones, and we're going to be discovering why Windows PowerShell is one of the most exciting things that's happened to Windows administrators in the Microsoft space in well, pretty much forever. Windows PowerShell is the first time that Microsoft has decided to officially support a means of scripting and automating Windows and server management. Windows PowerShell isn't just a scripting language like VBScript. It's a command shell where you can type commands and get immediate results. It's extremely gratifying, and it lets you build up slowly. It means you can learn the thing piece by piece. Here's the order in which we'll be learning those pieces. We're going to start by looking at what Windows PowerShell is and why you should care about it. We'll kind of look at the architecture of Windows PowerShell, talk about the future of Windows PowerShell, look specifically at some of the problems Windows PowerShell is meant to solve, and kind of place Windows PowerShell in the context of Windows administration. Next up, we'll talk about how to secure the shell, how to make sure that Windows PowerShell doesn't turn into another VB script where it's really just a security annoyance that you wish you could turn off. Then we'll get practical by looking at some means of managing files and folders with Windows PowerShell. And if you've ever worked with a command line shell before, even the command.exe shell built into Windows, you're going to find a lot that you'll like there. Then, because honestly learning any new product is really learning about the gotchas and the things that don't work quite like you think, we're going to look at some command line tips, tricks, and gotchas, where I'll share some of the things that kind of tripped me up when I first started using Windows PowerShell so that you don't get tripped up on those same things. Next, we'll talk about commandlets, snap-ins, aliases, and help. The ways that PowerShell really accomplishes what it does, and the ways that it helps you figure out what PowerShell can do and how to do it. Then we'll look at some of the basic commandlets included in Windows PowerShell for Windows management, managing processes, services, and event logs. Then we'll look at retrieving management info from remote computers, which is primarily going to focus on the technology called Windows Management Instrumentation, or WMI. That's a great way to sort of understand another way to do certain things in Windows PowerShell and bring in the ability to manage multiple remote computers right from the comfort of your desktop. Next, we'll talk about using variables, objects, and members in Windows PowerShell. The ways that Windows PowerShell stores data for continual reuse, and objects, which are really the basis of what PowerShell is and how it works. Then we're going to look at one of the most important concepts in Windows PowerShell. In fact, if you take nothing away, this is the stuff to take away: understanding the pipeline. The pipeline is what sets Windows PowerShell apart from all past shells that have appeared on Windows, such as command.exe, and sets it apart from some of the shells that have been used to manage operating systems dating 20 or 30 years back, like Unix. The pipeline is one of PowerShell's most important, most flexible, and most powerful features. And honestly, it can be a little fun, too. Now, after we talk about the pipeline, we'll talk about math and comparison operators in Windows PowerShell. We'll need to know how PowerShell performs math, and most importantly, how it compares things to one another, so that we can then go on to talk about how to sort, measure, select, and filter objects. In other words, once we've gotten a bunch of processes, or a bunch of services, or a bunch of event log entries, how can we sort those, measure various aspects of them, select just the bits of them that we want, and filter out the bits we don't want so that we can just be looking at the data that's important to us. Then we're going to talk about working with collections of objects, taking a whole bunch of processes and doing something to each one of them, or retrieving information from a whole bunch of computers and doing something with each bit. Next, we'll talk about Windows PowerShell's formatting subsystem, the way that Windows PowerShell displays information on the screen, and the ways that you can manipulate and control the formatting subsystem to get exactly the display you want. It's even kind of a quick and dirty way to create management reports, just by lining things up exactly the way you want them, and then maybe exporting them to a file, converting them to HTML, importing them back from a file and manipulating them, and then comparing different things, which will obviously be the next thing we move on to talk about. Then we'll talk about something that I know most Windows administrators deal with: how to automate Active Directory management, as well as local users and groups. We'll look at how to import a bunch of users from a file and create those accounts in Active Directory, and all sorts of really automated tasks. And finally, we're going to come to Windows PowerShell scripts. If you thought Windows PowerShell was a scripting language like VBScript, well, look how long it's taken us before we actually needed to talk about Windows PowerShell scripting. But we will come to that point. We will talk about what scripts are, why you use a script, when you wouldn't use a script, and pretty much how to make scripts work, how to write a script, and everything else you need to do about Windows PowerShell scripting. With Windows PowerShell scripting out in the open, we'll be able to move on and talk about its scripting language. And if you're a little worried about trying to learn to be a programmer, please don't be. Windows PowerShell's scripting language consists of about 14 keywords. Compare that with the over 100 keywords in a language like VBScript, and you'll see that Windows PowerShell is really trying to keep things simple and very, very task-focused. We'll then move on to talk about modularization, how you can create little chunks of scripts that you can reuse over and over. They're called script blocks and functions. And because the pipeline is such an important part of what Windows PowerShell is, we'll talk about how to write functions of your own that can work almost like built-in Windows PowerShell commands. I call them pipeline functions. And because objects are so much at the heart of what Windows PowerShell is and does, we'll also talk about creating functions that can produce your own objects. We'll sort of move to the more advanced side of scripting by looking at how to trap errors that occur inside of your script and deal with them yourself, so that if your script is trying to connect to a remote computer and maybe that computer is not available at the time, this is how you can deal with that. And finally, we'll wrap up the discussion on scripting by talking about script debugging. Look, nobody wants bugs in their scripts, but they're almost inevitable. And what you really want to be able to do is find the bugs and fix them quickly in a consistent fashion. So I'm going to share some techniques that Windows PowerShell has and some technologies that you can use to make script debugging quick, easy, and dare I say it, almost painless. And then we'll talk about regular expressions. Technology that Windows PowerShell has built right in to help it recognize different types of data based on their format. So you'll learn how to use that for data validation, as well as for things like parsing through text log files to find particular bits of information that you need. And then we'll wrap up by creating a real practical administrative tool in Windows PowerShell absolutely from scratch. We'll walk through the entire process of designing the tool, outlining the various bits of functionality that it needs, creating those various bits of functionality, actually programming them, testing them, debugging them, doing all of that work. Windows PowerShell is one of the most exciting things that's come along for Windows administrators, and I'm really excited to be sharing it with you.